I'm 76 years old. I delivered a child in 1978 that modern biology says cannot exist. I falsified the birth records. I've carried that decision for 46 years. My name is Dr. Robert Marsh. For 30 years, I served the logging communities scattered through the Cascade Mountains of rural Oregon. I delivered over 2,000 babies in my career. I can tell you the weight, length, and Apgar score of most of them from memory alone. But one birth I will never forget. November 14th, 1978. A cabin 15 miles beyond the last marked road. A woman who had been legally dead for 7 years, and an infant with a resting body temperature of 102 degrees Fahrenheit, hands 40% larger than any newborn I'd ever examined, and covered in thick, dark hair that had nothing to do with normal lanugo. Outside that cabin, something moved through the trees, something massive, watching, waiting, making sure its mate and child survived. I made a choice that night that haunts me still. I chose protection over truth, silence over science, and I would make the same choice again. This is exactly what happened. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. I know the exact time because I checked my watch before answering, a habit from 3 decades of emergency calls. My wife stirred beside me but didn't wake. November storms in the Cascades had trained us both to sleep through the sound of rain hammering our roof like gravel. The voice on the other end was male, young, terrified. "Dr. Marsh, you need to come. It's Sarah. The baby's coming early and something's wrong." I was already reaching for my pants. "Where are you? Who is this?" I can't explain on the phone. "You know the old logging road past Millerton Ridge? Take it to the end. There's a trail. I'll meet you." "I need more than that. I need a name. The line went dead. I sat on the edge of my bed in the darkness, receiver still in my hand. The rational response was to dismiss the call. No name, no address, no callback number. But something in that voice had been genuine, not a prank. Fear. And he'd said a name. Sarah. I drove in conditions that should have kept me home. The storm had turned the mountain roads into rivers of mud and fallen branches. Twice I had to stop and drag debris out of my path. My medical bag sat in the passenger seat, secured with the seatbelt so it wouldn't slide during the steep climbs. The logging road past Millerton Ridge hadn't been maintained in years. I nearly missed the turnoff. The path was barely wider than my truck, hemmed in by Douglas firs that had reclaimed the edges. My headlights caught nothing but rain and darkness and the occasional flash of animal eyes. I'd been driving these mountains since 1948. I knew every official road, every marked trail. This route was taking me somewhere that didn't exist on any map I'd ever studied. After 40 minutes, the road simply ended. A wall of forest, a small clearing barely large enough to turn around, and, standing in my headlights, a young man in his early 20s wearing a canvas coat soaked black with rain. I grabbed my bag and stepped out. The wind nearly took the truck door off its hinges. "Dr. Marsh?" He had to shout over the storm. "Who are you?" "Name's Michael. I live up at the Henderson place, about 3 miles south. Sarah asked me to call you, to guide you in." "Sarah who?" He looked at me for a long moment, rain streaming down his face. "Sarah Ramsey." The name hit me like a physical blow. Sarah Ramsey had disappeared in the summer of 1971. 23 years old, an experienced hiker, vanished during a solo trek through the Cascades. Search parties had combed the forests for weeks. They'd found her campsite, her backpack, signs of a struggle, blood on the rocks. The official conclusion was animal attack, body carried off or consumed. Her parents had held a funeral with an empty casket 7 years ago, legally declared dead 5 years ago. "That's not possible," I said. "Yeah." Michael turned toward the tree line. "That's what I thought too. Come on, it's another 2 miles. We need to move. The trail was barely visible even with the flashlight Michael carried. We climbed the gate through the underbrush that tore at my coat, crossed a stream swollen with runoff that nearly swept me off my feet, pushed through stands of cedar so dense I lost sight of the sky. Michael moved with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey many times. I struggled to keep pace, my medical bag growing heavier with each step. 40 minutes in, my legs shaking with exhaustion, I saw a light ahead. The cabin was small, primitive. Logs chinked with moss and mud. A roof that was mostly cedar shake with gaps patched by what looked like animal hides. No power lines, no road access. A structure that belonged to a century earlier, somehow surviving in a pocket of forest that had escaped logging operations and fire and everything else that had transformed these mountains. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. A single window glowed with firelight. Michael stopped at the edge of the clearing. I'll wait out here. She doesn't want a crowd. You're not coming in? I'm just the messenger, Doc. This is your job. He gestured toward the cabin. Doors open. I crossed the clearing alone. Each step felt heavier than the last. The rain had diminished to a steady drizzle, but the wind still moved through the trees with a sound like distant voices. I pushed open the door. The interior was lit by a stone fireplace and 3 oil lamps. The furniture was handmade, rough but sturdy. A table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with glass jars containing preserved foods, furs and woven blankets hanging from the walls. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something animal and unfamiliar. A woman lay on a bed in the corner, her face sheened with sweat. I knew her immediately, even after 7 years. Sarah Ramsey, thinner than the photos I remembered from the missing persons posters. Her dark hair longer, braided and shot through with premature gray, but the same face, the same woman who was supposed to be dead. She looked at me with eyes that held no surprise, only pain and exhaustion. Dr. Marsh, thank you for coming. I set my bag down, my training overriding my shock. How far apart are your contractions? 5 minutes, maybe less now. She gripped the edge of the blanket. It's too early. I'm only 34 weeks. I moved to her side, beginning my examination. Her pulse was elevated but strong. Temperature slightly high but within acceptable range. The contractions were regular, powerful. This baby was coming whether it was time or not. Sarah, I need to understand. I know what you're thinking. She breathed through another contraction, her jaw clenched. I know what everyone thinks happened to me, and I'm telling you right now, Doc, you're going to see things tonight that you won't want to believe. But I need you to focus on keeping this baby alive. Questions can come after. I opened my bag, laying out instruments by feel, my hands moving through procedures I'd performed 1,000 times. But my mind was racing. 7 years in these mountains. Surviving alone. Pregnant. Is there a father? Someone I should... Before she could answer, I felt it. A change in the air pressure, the sense of being watched. I turned toward the window. Beyond the wavy glass, in the darkness between the trees, something moved. Something far too large to be a man. Sarah's hand caught my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. He's just making sure we're safe, she said quietly. He won't come closer while you're here, but he's watching. He's always watching. I stared at her, this woman who should be dead, lying in a cabin that shouldn't exist, about to give birth in the middle of a wilderness storm. Who's watching, Sarah? She met my eyes. The next contraction hit her, and she wrote it out before answering. The father. I had no time to process her words. The contractions were accelerating. Sarah's water broke at 1:15 a.m., and I shifted into the methodical focus that had carried me through decades of rural deliveries in less than ideal conditions. But even as I worked, I catalogued the strangeness of this place. The cabin was a single room, perhaps 20 feet by 15. The bed frame was constructed from branches still wearing their bark, lashed together with what appeared to be braided sinew. The mattress was a thick pad of woven cedar bark covered in layers of fur, deer, elk, and something darker I couldn't immediately identify. The fireplace was the most sophisticated element of the structure, built with river stones fitted so precisely that little mortar was needed. A cast iron pot hung from an iron hook. The smell coming from it was rich, gamey. Venison stew, I thought, though I'd never smelled venison quite like that. The shelves held dozens of mason jars, the glass old and clouded but the seals intact. Preserved berries, roots, what looked like dried mushrooms. A collection that spoke of someone who knew these mountains intimately, who understood what the forest offered in each season. There was no evidence of modern convenience, no battery-powered radio, no propane lantern, no plastic of any kind. Even the rope securing bundles of dried herbs to the ceiling beams was natural fiber, hand-twisted. This wasn't a cabin someone visited on weekends. This was a life, a complete self-contained existence carved out of the wilderness with no connection to the world I'd driven from just hours earlier. I sterilized my instruments in boiling water from the fireplace, working by lamplight that threw shadows across the rough log walls. Sarah endured the contractions with remarkable stoicism, her breathing controlled, her focus inward. I delivered babies to women who screamed, who cursed, who begged for drugs I couldn't provide. Sarah was silent except for low, measured exhalations. "You've done this before," I said. It wasn't a question. "No, first time." She managed something close to a smile, but I've seen it, watched it. I know what my body needs to do. I didn't ask her to explain. Not yet. The cabin had 2 windows, one facing east toward the clearing where Michael waited, another facing west into deeper forest. As I worked, I became increasingly conscious of that western window. Several times I caught movement in my peripheral vision, large shapes shifting between the trees. At 2:30 a.m., during a brief respite between contractions, I went to the window. The rain had stopped. Moonlight broke through thinning clouds, illuminating the forest in shades of silver and black. The trees here were old-growth cedar and Douglas fir, some of them easily 8 feet in diameter. The spaces between them were dense with undergrowth, sword fern and sallow creating an impenetrable tangle. Something stood at the edge of that tangle, 70, maybe 80 yards from the cabin. The scale was wrong. My brain tried to interpret it as a bear standing upright, but the proportions didn't match. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long, the head shape all wrong. It was watching the cabin, watching me. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Don't be afraid," Sarah said from the bed. Her voice was strained but calm. "He won't come closer. Not while you're here. He knows you're helping." "Sarah, what is that?" "The father." She gripped the blanket as another contraction began to build. "His name, well, he doesn't have a name the way we do, but I call him Elder. He's old, Doc, older than any of us could imagine." I returned to her side, forcing myself back into clinical mode. Checked. Dilation, 8 centimeters. The baby's heart rate was strong, but faster than normal. Not dangerously so, but elevated. "When you disappeared," I said carefully, measuring my words against the rhythm of her breathing, "everyone thought you were dead. Your parents buried an empty casket." "I know." Pain flickered across her face, and I couldn't tell if it was from the contraction or something else. I couldn't go back. By the time I understood what had happened, what I'd become, it was too late. I'd been gone too long, and I was carrying his child. "Sarah, you understand this is impossible. biologically impossible. She laughed, a short, sharp sound. You think I don't know that? I was a biology major, Doc. 2 years at University of Oregon before I dropped out. I know what the textbooks say about species barriers and reproductive isolation and genetic incompatibility. Another contraction, stronger this time. She bore down, her body taking over. The textbooks are wrong, she gasped when it passed. Or incomplete, or they never had all the data because nobody ever survived this long to tell them. I checked her cervix again. Nearly complete. The baby was in position, head down, engaged. Everything proceeding normally except for the absolute impossibility of the situation. I need to examine the baby when it's born, I said. I need to understand what we're dealing with. I know. That's why I asked Michael to call you. You're a good man, Doc. Everyone in these mountains knows that. You don't gossip. You don't judge. And you keep secrets when they need keeping. What secrets am I keeping? She met my eyes. The next contraction was building. I could see it in the tightening of her abdomen, the change in her breathing. The secret that could get my child dissected in a government laboratory, that could get Elder hunted down like an animal, that could prove to the world that we're not alone in these forests, that we never were. The contraction peaked. Sarah pushed. I positioned myself to receive the infant, my hand steady despite everything, despite the impossibility, despite the shape in the trees outside. One more like that, I told her. Maybe 2. Your baby's almost here. Through the western window, I felt, more than saw, the presence draw marginally closer. Still distant, still cautious, but attentive with an intensity I'd never experienced from any animal. Sarah screamed, not in pain, but in effort, in the primal work of bringing life into the world. And in the forest, something answered. A vocalization I'd never heard before. Low and resonant and unmistakably aware. The baby crowned. I caught my first glimpse of dark hair. Too much hair. Far too much. Again, I told Sarah, push again. She did. And I delivered a child that would change everything I thought I knew about the limits of life on Earth. Dr. Robert Marsh died in 1994 at the age of 68. He never spoke publicly about what happened in that cabin. But his daughter found his private journals while settling his estate. 17 notebooks filled with observations, measurements, and questions he could never answer. In one entry, dated November the 15th, 1978, he wrote, "Filed birth certificate for Sarah Ramsey's child. Listed father as unknown. Listed minor anomalies. Excessive hair, larger than normal extremities, attributed to genetic variation within normal range. The lies come easier than I expected. What doesn't come easy is knowing I've buried evidence of the most significant biological discovery of the century. But when I think about what would happen if I told the truth, the government agents, the laboratory dissections, the media circus, the hunters who would tear these mountains apart looking for specimens, I know I made the right choice. Some secrets protect the innocent. This is one of them. He made supply runs to the cabin 3 more times over the next 2 years. The last time he went, in the spring of 1981, the cabin was empty. The structure remained, but every personal item was gone. No sign of Sarah, no sign of the child, no indication of where they'd gone. Michael Henderson, the young man who guided him that night, moved to Seattle in 1982. He died in 2003 without ever confirming or denying the story. Sarah Ramsey's official death certificate was never amended. As far as the state of Oregon is concerned, she died in 1971 at the age of 23. But somewhere in the vast, unexplored forests of the Pacific Northwest, there may be a bloodline that bridges the gap between human and something older. A hybrid that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of biology. A living answer to the question we've been asking since the first European settlers reported massive footprints in the mud and voices in the forest that belonged to no known animal. Dr. Marsh's journals raise more questions than they answer, but they force us to consider what we would do in his position, faced with a truth that could rewrite textbooks, or a secret that could destroy lives. The Cascade Mountains cover over 700 miles of wilderness. Most of it has never been fully explored. Most of it never will be. And according to one country doctor who carried a secret for 16 years, that's exactly how it should stay. Subscribe to Alien Files, because the truth isn't just out there. It's in the places we've agreed not to look. The infant arrived at 3:47 a.m. I caught the child in my hands the way I'd done hundreds of times before. The same motions, the same protocols drilled into me over 3 decades of practice. Clear the airway, assess the breathing, check the color. Then I actually looked at what I was holding. The baby's skin was flushed deep pink, almost red. Not the mottled purple-blue of oxygen deprivation. Not the pale translucence of shock. A ruddy, vital color that radiated heat against my palms like I was holding something fresh from an oven. I reached for my thermometer on instinct. The mercury climbed past 100 degrees. Past 101. It stopped at 102.3. I checked it again. Same result. In any normal newborn, that temperature would indicate sepsis, meningitis, some catastrophic infection, requiring immediate intervention. But this infant was breathing steadily, crying with full lung capacity. The fontanelles weren't bulging, no lethargy, no mottling. The child was thriving at a temperature that should have indicated crisis. I looked at Sarah. She was watching my face, not the baby. "He's healthy," she said. Not a question. I didn't answer yet. I was still cataloging. The hands drew my attention next. I've measured thousands of newborns. The average infant hand measures roughly 3 inches from wrist to fingertip. These hands exceeded 4 inches. The fingers were proportionally long, the palms broad. Not swollen, not edematous. Simply built on a different scale. The feet were the same. When I measured the left foot against the reference chart I kept in my bag, it fell outside the 99th percentile for newborn size. These weren't the chubby, compressed feet of a typical infant. They were already formed, structured, functional. The toes could grip. I watched them curl around my thumb with surprising strength. Then there was the hair. All babies have some degree of lanugo, fine, downy hair that covers the fetus in the womb and typically sheds before or shortly after birth. I'd seen plenty of infants born with patches of it still clinging to their shoulders or back. This wasn't lanugo. A thick covering of dark brown hair ran across the baby's shoulders, down the spine, along the outer arms and legs. Not fuzzy, not soft. Actual hair with body and texture, like the coat of a young primate. I touched it. It felt coarse under my fingers, nothing like the silk fine wisps I was accustomed to. I drew my hand back. The baby turned its head toward Sarah. The movement was too coordinated, too purposeful. Newborns don't track like that. Their vision is limited to roughly 8 to 12 inches. Their muscle control minimal. They root and grasp on reflex. This child turned its head and focused. The eyes found Sarah's face and held. I have no medical explanation for that. I wrapped the infant in the cleanest blanket I could find and handed him to Sarah. She took him without hesitation, brought him to her chest. He latched immediately. Again, too efficient, too deliberate. Most newborns struggle with their first feeding, fumbling for the nipple, losing the seal. This child fed like an animal that knew exactly what survival required. I stepped back to the corner of the room where I'd left my bag. My hands were shaking. I've delivered breech births. I've delivered twins with complications. I've kept premature infants alive with nothing but basic equipment and determination. I know how to manage crisis. I know how to control fear and continue working. But I had no protocol for this. I looked down at the notes I'd started on my pad. Heart rate, respiratory rate, APGAR score, all the mechanical data points I was trained to record. I hadn't written down the truth that the bone density in those tiny limbs felt heavier than it should, that the muscle tone was more developed than any full-term infant I'd handled, that the proportions were wrong in ways I couldn't reconcile with any genetic condition I'd studied. And I hadn't written the temperature. I'd checked it 3 times, and I still hadn't committed it to paper. Because writing it down would mean acknowledging what I was thinking. Sarah was humming something low and rhythmic. The baby had quieted. I forced myself to finish the essential checks. Counted fingers and toes. 10 of each. All present and functional. Just oversized. Examined the umbilical stump. Clean cut. No signs of infection. Checked the spine. Intact. No obvious neural tube defects. Everything worked. Everything functioned. It just wasn't entirely human. I don't know how long I stood there trying to fit what I was seeing into some framework that made sense. Genetic mutation, endocrine disorder, some syndrome so rare I'd simply never encountered it in my rural practice. But I've seen birth defects. I've seen developmental abnormalities. They present as problems, weaknesses, failures of the system. This child wasn't failing. This child was robust in ways that exceeded human norms. The wind outside had died down. The rain had softened to a steady patter. And in that relative quiet, I heard something else. Movement in the trees. Not small. Not a deer or elk shifting position. Something large, circling the cabin. Sarah heard it too. Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to me. "He's been out there the whole time," she said. I knew who she meant. I pulled a stool close to the bed and sat down. Sarah was still holding the baby, her posture relaxed in a way that seemed impossible for someone who'd just given birth in a wilderness cabin with no anesthesia. She looked tired but not depleted, focused but not afraid. "Tell me what happened," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, deciding something. "July 1971, she began. I was 22. I just finished my degree at Portland State and I wanted time alone before starting a teaching job that fall. So I went hiking, solo, 3-day loop trail in the Gifford-Pinchot area. I remembered the case. The search had made regional news. Sarah Ramsey, recent college graduate, reported missing when she failed to return from a documented wilderness trip. Search and rescue found her car at the trailhead, found her planned route logged with the ranger station. Never found her. "Second day on the trail," she continued, "I came around a bend and walked straight into a black bear. Female. She had a cub maybe 30 feet away in the brush. I've lived in Oregon long enough to know that scenario ends one way. She hit me before I could even raise my arms. I remember going down. I remember her weight on my chest and not being able to breathe. I thought my ribs were broken. Probably were. Then I passed out. She adjusted the baby's position, checked that he was still, feeding. When I woke up, I was in a cave. Not a small one. Big enough to stand in, deep enough that daylight didn't reach the back. I was lying on a bed of moss and dried grass, and he was sitting maybe 10 feet away watching me. The Sasquatch. I didn't have a word for it then. I just saw something massive and covered in hair, and I tried to scream. Nothing came out. My throat was too damaged. I tried to stand and my legs wouldn't work, so I just lay there and stared at him. What did he do? Nothing. He sat. He watched. After a while, he brought me water in a piece of bark folded into a cup, set it down within reach and backed away, waited for me to drink. She paused. I thought I was hallucinating. Blood loss, head trauma, shock. I went through every explanation. But the water was real. The cave was real. And when I could finally move enough to check myself, I found that something had cleaned my wounds and packed them with moss and what looked like chewed-up plants. Poultice, basically. I've read about this. Jane Goodall documented chimpanzees using medicinal plants to treat wounds and illness. Dian Fossey observed gorillas doing the same. If Sasquatch were another hominid species, closely related enough to share certain cognitive abilities, self-medication wouldn't be impossible. But applying that knowledge to save a member of a different species, that suggested something more. How long were you in the cave? Weeks, maybe a month. I lost track of time. He brought me food. Berries, roots, fish from the stream. Never meat, which surprised me later when I thought about it. He'd killed that bear. I saw the carcass outside the cave entrance that first week, but he didn't try to feed me any of it. He knew you couldn't digest it raw, I said. That's what I eventually figured. He understood I was different, fragile. He adjusted his behavior to keep me alive. The baby had fallen asleep against her chest. She shifted him gently to her. Shoulder began a slow, rhythmic patting on his back. The motion was automatic, maternal. But the story she was telling didn't match the woman I'd known from news reports. A promising young teacher. Conventional life ahead of her. No indication she'd choose to vanish into the wilderness forever. When did you decide not to go back? She looked toward the cabin's single window. Dawn was starting to break. Thin gray light filtered through gaps in the shutters. I could walk again after about 6 weeks. I was weak but functional. One morning I woke up and he wasn't in the cave. I walked to the entrance and I could see the forest. I knew roughly which direction would take me back toward the trail system. I could have started walking. But you didn't. I got maybe 100 yards. Then I stopped, and I really thought about what I was walking back to. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't have family. Both parents dead by the time I was 19. No siblings. The friends I had in Portland were circumstantial. People I knew from classes, roommates I'd lived with for a year and barely kept in touch with after we moved out. The teaching job was in a town I'd never been to, working with people I'd never met. I understood what she was describing. Not depression, not suicidal ideation, just the cold arithmetic of a life without deep roots. And when I thought about him, she continued, I realized he'd spent weeks keeping me alive. He didn't have to. He could have left me in the woods after the bear attack, could have let me die in that cave, but he brought me water every day. He checked my wounds. He sat with me when I was scared. So you went back. I went back, and I stayed. The thing in the trees moved again, closer now. I could hear branches shifting under a significant weight. That first year was just survival, Sarah said, learning to live the way he did, how to find clean water, which plants were safe, how to preserve food for winter. He taught me, without words, just showed me, waited for me to understand. And then it became something else. Partnership. We took care of each other. When he was injured, cut his hand badly on a rock face one winter, I cleaned it and wrapped it the way he'd done for me. When I got sick with what must have been influenza, he kept me warm and brought me water and food until I recovered. She looked down at the sleeping baby. Somewhere in the 3rd year, I realized I trusted him more than I'd ever trusted any human. And when he brought me here, to this cabin that he'd found abandoned and made weatherproof, I understood he was offering me something permanent. A home. A life. With him. The baby stirred, made a small sound. Sarah adjusted her hold and he settled again. I know what people would think, she said. That I was coerced. That I have Stockholm Syndrome or some trauma response that makes me defend my captor. But I wasn't captured. I chose this. Every day for 7 years, I've chosen this. I looked around the cabin. at the hand-hewn furniture, the carefully stacked firewood, the evidence of a life built deliberately in the margins of the world. "And now you've chosen to bring a child into it," I said. "Yes." "Do you understand what that means? What he is?" "I understand he's my son. That's what he needs to be." The thing outside had stopped moving. I couldn't hear it anymore, but I could feel it. A presence just beyond the walls, massive and patient and waiting for my answer. Sarah was watching my face again. "You're going to have to make a choice, Dr. Marsh," she said quietly. "The same choice I made 7 years ago. You can go back to your world and tell them what you found. Or you can protect something that doesn't fit in that world." The baby opened his eyes. Even in the dim light of dawn, I could see they were alert, focused, watching me the way his father was watching from the trees. Sarah's breathing had steadied. The infant nursed, awkwardly, but successfully. I checked her vitals again, more out of habit than necessity. She was stable, strong even. Stronger than most women I'd delivered in sterile hospital rooms with epidurals and monitors. I needed to understand what I was documenting, what I was choosing not to report. "How long have you been out here?" I asked. She looked at me with those clear, untroubled eyes. 7 years. Almost exactly. I'd already done the math. She'd vanished in May of 1971. It was now February 1978. "And you've been with him all that time?" "Not at first." She adjusted the baby against her chest. "At first I was just trying not to die." I sat back on the wooden stool. My bag was packed. My work was done. But I couldn't leave yet. "The bear attack," I said. "Tell me what happened after." She was quiet for a moment. Then she began. She'd woken up in a cave. Not a shallow rock shelter, but a deep cavern system that retained heat and stayed dry even in heavy rain. Her leg was wrapped in what she later realized were broad leaves, plastered with a poultice of moss and crushed plants. The pain was immense, but the bleeding had stopped. She thought she was hallucinating when she first saw him. 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, shoulders wider than any man's. But it was the face that made her certain she was dying, and her brain was creating comforting fictions. Because nothing that large, that powerful, should have eyes that expressive. He brought her water in a section of bark that had been shaped into a crude bowl. He brought her fish, already cleaned. He brought her roots that she later learned were edible, nutritious, and grew only in specific parts of the forest. He never made a sound, not a grunt, not a growl. He moved in complete silence despite his size. "I was terrified for weeks," Sarah said. "I couldn't walk, couldn't run. I just waited for him to kill me, or eat me, or whatever I thought he'd do. But he didn't. No, he kept me alive." She looked down at the baby, then back at me. And I started to realize he wasn't keeping me. He was caring for me. There's a difference. She described how he would leave at dawn and return at dusk, how he'd check her leg, gently unwrapping and rewrapping it with fresh poultices. How he'd sit across the cave and watch her, not with hunger or malice, but with something she eventually recognized as concern. "I tried to talk to him at first," she said, "but he never answered. I don't think he can, not with words, but he understands. I'm sure of that." She healed slowly. By the time autumn came, she could walk with a limp. The scar tissue was thick and permanent, but functional. She could have left. "Why didn't you?" I asked. She smiled, and it was the first time I'd seen her smile. It changed her entire face. "I did try. Once. I made it maybe 2 miles before I realized I had no idea where I was. The terrain out here, it all looks the same if you don't know it. I was lost within an hour." She'd sat down on a fallen log and cried. not from fear, but from the sudden, crushing awareness that she had no home to return to anyway. Her parents were dead. She'd been working a waitressing job she hated in a town where she knew no one. She'd gone hiking to clear her head after another argument with a boyfriend who hit her when he drank. I sat there and thought about what I'd be going back to, she said quietly. And then I heard him. He'd followed her, stayed back, out of sight, but tracked her the entire way. When she stood up and started walking back toward the cave, he walked parallel to her through the trees. She never saw him, but she heard branches shifting, felt him there. When she reached the cave, he was already inside, adding wood to the fire he'd taught himself to maintain. That's when I knew, she said. He wasn't holding me captive. He'd let me go. And I came back. Over the next year, fear became familiarity. Familiarity became trust. Trust became something neither of them had words for. She learned his patterns. He learned hers. She discovered he avoided other humans entirely, moving the cave locations seasonally to stay ahead of hunters and loggers. She realized he brought her the best food, the warmest pelts, and positioned himself between her and the cave entrance every night, not trapping her in, but standing guard. He never tried to touch me, Sarah said, and I heard the importance in her voice. Not once, not in that way, not until I touched him first. It happened in the second winter. She'd been cold, even near the fire. He was sitting against the cave wall, and without thinking she moved closer, leaned against him. His body temperature was higher than hers, like the baby's, I noted mentally. The heat radiated through his fur. He went completely still. Then, slowly, he shifted his arm to shelter her from the draft coming through the cave mouth. That's when it changed, she said softly. That's when I understood what he'd been waiting for. Permission. I should have been horrified. Every instinct from my training, my culture, my species said I should be horrified. But I'd seen the care in this cabin. I'd seen the supplies he must have scavenged or stolen over the years to give her some comfort. Tin plates, wool blankets, a rusted knife. I'd seen the baby, unmistakably half-human, nursing peacefully. And I'd seen Sarah's face when she talked about him. It wasn't madness. It wasn't coercion. It was the same expression I'd seen on my wife's face 30 years ago when she talked about our future. You love him, I said. She didn't hesitate. Yes. And he loves you. In his way, yes. She stroked the baby's head. He doesn't understand human things, but he understands protection, provision, partnership. Isn't that what love is? I thought of the creature outside, pacing in the dark, trusting me with his mate and newborn because Sarah had asked him to, waiting, watching. Jane Goodall lived among chimpanzees for years. Diane Fossey was murdered defending her gorillas. Both women describe bonds with non-human apes that transcended simple observation, relationships built on mutual respect and trust. This was the same, just further. Does he have a name? I asked. Sarah shook her head. I call him different things. But he doesn't use names. He knows me. I know him. That's enough. And the baby? Samuel, she said firmly, after my grandfather, the only family I ever really had. Samuel, a human name for something not entirely human. I wrote it down in my notes, knowing I'd have to change it later, knowing I was already complicit in this impossible secret. What will you do? I asked. When he's older, when he needs, I don't know, Sarah interrupted, but we'll figure it out. We always do. She said we, not I. Outside, a branch cracked. Not from wind, from weight. Sarah glanced at the door, then back at me. He'll want to see him. The baby. Will you stay? Just a few more minutes? Every rational part of me screamed to refuse, to leave, to get back to the world where things made sense. but I'd already crossed the line the moment I delivered that child. "Yes," I said. "I'll stay." The fire had burned down to coals. Sarah was resting, the baby asleep against her chest. I should have left an hour ago. The storm had passed. My truck was still parked where I'd abandoned it, 2 miles down an overgrown logging road. But I hadn't moved, because I could feel him now. Not just hear him, feel him. The way you feel a thunderstorm building before the first lightning strikes. "He's close," Sarah said without opening her eyes. "How close?" "Just outside. He's been circling since the baby came." I stood slowly, my knees protesting. I was 52 years old, and I'd spent the night delivering a child that rewrote biology. My hands were steady. I'd always had steady hands. But my pulse was hammering. "What does he want?" I asked. "To see his son." Sarah opened her eyes. "And to see you." "Me? You helped us. He understands that." She shifted carefully, sitting up. "He won't hurt you, but he needs to know you're not a threat." The cabin had gaps between the logs where the chinking had crumbled away. I'd been avoiding looking at them. Now I moved toward the nearest one, a crack about 2 inches wide that faced the eastern tree line. "Dr. Marsh," Sarah said quietly, "don't run, no matter what you see. If you run, his instincts will. Just don't run." I pressed my face close to the gap. For a moment, I saw nothing but darkness and the silhouettes of pine trees against the pre-dawn sky. Then the silhouette moved. No, not the trees. Something between the trees. He stepped forward into the clearing. I'd spent 4 years in the Navy during World War II. I'd seen men die. I'd seen ships burn. I'd developed a capacity for keeping my composure when my brain was screaming. I used all of it now. He was larger than I'd imagined, not just tall, massive. Shoulders that would have to turn sideways to fit through a standard door. Arms that hung past his knees, thick with muscle under dark auburn fur. Legs like tree trunks. But it was the face that stopped my breathing. Not because it was monstrous, because it wasn't. The bone structure was heavy, prominent. The brow ridge was pronounced, the jaw powerful. But the proportions were there, the symmetry. It was a face, not human, but not animal either. Something in between. Something that shared an ancestor with me, maybe 6 million years ago, and then walked a different path. He took another step, then another, moving with impossible silence for something that must have weighed 500 pounds. 30 feet away now. 20. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the cabin, and looked directly at the gap I was watching through. The eyes. Christ, the eyes. I'd expected animal eyes. Flat, unreflective. The eyes of instinct and appetite. These were not those eyes. They were deep set under that heavy brow, but they caught the faint light from inside the cabin. Amber brown, flecked with gold. And in them I saw what I'd seen in the eyes of fathers in delivery rooms for 30 years. Fear, hope, desperate concern. He was terrified for his family. I'd read John Green's reports, Jeff Meldrum's analyses of footprint casts. Every credible account described Sasquatch as non-aggressive, observational, avoidant. The watcher in the woods. A creature that fled from human contact rather than seeking it. This one wasn't fleeing, because his mate and newborn son were inside a wooden box with a stranger. We stared at each other. I don't know for how long. Long enough for the sky to lighten from black to deep blue. Long enough for me to catalog every detail. The silver streaking through the fur on his chest. The old scar across his left shoulder. The way his hands flexed and relaxed. Hands. Not paws. Not claws. Hands with opposable thumbs and articulated fingers. "He won't come inside," Sarah said from behind me. "Not with you here. But he needs to know the baby's all right." I stepped back from the gap, moved to where Sarah sat, looked down at the sleeping infant, at Samuel she'd called him, with his 2 large hands and his impossible body temperature and his thick, dark hair. I picked him up, carefully, the way I'd picked up 1,000 newborns, and I carried him to the door. "Dr. Marsh." Sarah's voice was tight. "It's all right," I said. I didn't know if that was true, but I said it anyway. I lifted the wooden latch. The door swung inward on leather hinges. The cold air hit me first, then the smell, earth and pine, and something musky, organic, animal, but not unpleasant. Then I saw him fully, without walls or gaps between us. He stood 15 feet away, perfectly still, every muscle coiled, ready to move, but holding himself back with visible effort. I held out the baby, not offering, just showing. "He's healthy," I said. My voice sounded strange in the open air, too small. "Your son is healthy." I don't know if he understood the words, but he understood the meaning. He took 1 step forward, then stopped, looking at me, asking permission. I nodded. Another step, another, until he was close enough that I could see the pattern of lighter and darker fur across his chest, the way his breath misted in the cold air. He lowered his head, looking at the baby. Samuel stirred, made a small sound. His eyes opened, unfocused, cloudy the way all newborns' eyes are. The creature made a sound then, the first sound I'd heard from him. It was low, resonant. It came from deep in his chest. Not a growl, not a roar. Something closer to a purr, a rumble of relief and recognition. Samuel turned his head toward the sound, toward his father. I watched a Sasquatch meet his son for the first time, and I understood why Sarah had stayed. This was not a monster, not an animal. This was a person. Different biology, different species, but a person nonetheless, with emotions, with family bonds, with a capacity for love. He reached out one massive hand, slowly, carefully, and touched the baby's head with one knuckle. The gentleness was startling, deliberate, the same way I'd seen silverback gorillas handle their infants in the nature documentaries my daughter watched. "He's strong," I said quietly. "He'll survive." The creature's eyes shifted from the baby to me. We were close enough now that I could see the flecks of gold in the amber, close enough that he could have killed me with one swing of those arms. He didn't. He straightened, stepped back, gave me space. Then he looked past me to the cabin, to where Sarah was surely watching. The expression that crossed his face, if I'd seen it on a human, I would have called it tenderness. He turned and walked back toward the tree line, not hurrying, not fleeing, just leaving because he'd seen what he needed to see. At the edge of the clearing, he paused, looked back once. I raised my hand. I don't know why. Acknowledgement, maybe. Respect. He held my gaze for one more moment. Then he was gone. Not crashing through the brush like a panicked animal. Gone like smoke, like shadow, like something that had lived in these forests for millennia and knew every path, every sound, every way to disappear. I stood in the doorway holding a hybrid infant while the sun rose over the Cascade Mountains, and I realized I'd just made the most important decision of my medical career. I was going to lie. I was going to falsify every record, bury every anomaly, protect this family with the same oath I'd taken to protect all my patients. Because if the world found out what I'd seen, this wouldn't be a family anymore. It would be a specimen collection. I carried Samuel back inside and closed the door. The baby's body temperature stabilized at 101.8 degrees. Not normal, not fatal, just different. I sat in Sarah's one wooden chair and watched her nurse the child. The infant latched perfectly, fed with vigor, showed every sign of health except the ones that made it impossible. I kept returning to the same calculations. Hands 40% oversized, Bone density I could feel through the skin. Hair coverage I'd never seen on any newborn in 30 years of practice. I was looking at proof, not a story, not a footprint in mud or blurry photographs that skeptics could dismiss. A living organism that couldn't exist according to every biology textbook I'd studied. A viable hybrid between human and something else. The scientific implications were staggering. If this child survived, if it could grow, develop, potentially reproduce, it meant Sasquatch weren't just an unknown species of ape. They were close enough to human to produce fertile offspring. A sister species. A cousin on the evolutionary tree we thought we'd mapped completely. I thought about what this could mean for anthropology, genetics, evolutionary biology. Every assumption about human uniqueness would need revision. The textbooks would be rewritten. Museums would rebuild their exhibits. Darwin's tree would gain a branch we'd somehow missed. Then I thought about what happens when you make that kind of discovery. The phone calls to colleagues, the verification process, the peer review, then the news coverage, the government agencies. And Sarah's cabin in the forest wouldn't stay secret for more than 48 hours after I filed my report. I'd read the declassified documents from Project Blue Book, knew how the Air Force approached phenomena they couldn't explain. Investigation meant containment. Study meant control. They would come with credentials and polite questions, but they would take the child. They would take Sarah. They would search these woods until they found the father. This family would become specimens, research subjects, proof. I watched Sarah stroke the baby's oversized hand, humming something soft and wordless. She looked at me, and the question was already in her eyes. She knew what I was thinking. She'd known since the moment I'd seen her face during the delivery that this night would end with a choice. "What will you put in your records?" Her voice was quiet but steady. I didn't answer immediately. Outside, something moved through the pre-dawn darkness. A shape too large to be deer. The father, still watching, still waiting to see if I was a threat. Dawn came slowly through the storm clouds. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the cabin's eaves, marking time while I sat with Sarah and worked through the consequences. "If I document the truth," I said, "you have maybe 2 days before someone comes to verify. A week at most before it reaches people with resources and authority. They'll call it the discovery of the century. They'll want the child examined, tested, studied. You'll both be famous. You'll also never be free again." Sarah nodded. She'd already understood this. "If I falsify the records," I continued, "I list this as a normal home birth with minor abnormalities. Slightly elevated temperature, larger than average extremities. Abnormal hair growth. Unusual, but not impossible. I recommend follow-up care you'll never receive, because you'll disappear back into these woods and I'll never see you again. Which means no one believes you if you ever change your mind," she said. "Once you file false records, the evidence is gone. You can't undo that choice." She was right. The moment I wrote "normal human infant" in my log, I would be complicit. A lie on paper that would protect them, but erase the most significant biological finding of the modern era. My name wouldn't appear in journals or textbooks. I wouldn't revolutionize primatology or rewrite evolutionary biology. I would just be a country doctor who delivered a baby in a remote cabin and noted nothing unusual, except I would know. For the rest of my life, I would carry this. "What happens to him?" I asked, looking at the sleeping infant. "What kind of life does a child like this have?" "The same life his father has," Sarah said. "Hidden, protected, free." She met my eyes. "That's more than he'd have in a laboratory." I thought about my oath. First, do no harm. I thought about what harm looked like in this context. Not disease or injury, but exposure. the destruction that comes from being proven real. I opened my medical bag and found the blank birth record form I'd brought. My pen hesitated over the paper. "I need you to understand what you're asking me to do," I said. "I'm a scientist. This discovery could change everything we know about human evolution, about species classification, about what's possible. And you're asking me to pretend I saw nothing." "I'm asking you to be a doctor," Sarah said. "Not a scientist. A doctor who protects his patients." I wrote the date, then the location, approximate because the cabin had no address. Then the mother's name, Sarah Ramsey, legally dead but very much alive in my handwriting. Under infant description, I documented elevated body temperature, enlarged hands and feet, excessive hair growth, abnormalities that might warrant follow-up but wouldn't trigger investigation, a baby unusual enough to match what I'd witnessed, but human enough to file away. I didn't write the truth about what I'd delivered. I didn't document the father watching from the forest. I didn't note that this child represented a hybrid species that shouldn't exist. I signed my name at the bottom, Dr. Robert Marsh, attending physician. The lie was complete. Sarah took the copy I gave her, though we both knew she'd burn it within a day. The official record would go into a filing cabinet at the county office, where it would gather dust alongside thousands of other rural births. Unremarkable, forgettable. I packed my supplies and prepared to leave. Outside, the forest was silent. The massive presence I'd sensed all night had withdrawn, though I couldn't say when or how I knew. "Will you come back?" Sarah asked. "No," I said. "It's safer if I don't know where you are." She nodded. We both understood that protection meant distance. The less I knew about their movements, their location, their continued existence, the less I could reveal if questioned. I reached the cabin door and turned back one final time. Sarah held her child close, and in the early morning light filtering through the gaps in the wooden walls, I could see them clearly. A mother and her impossible baby, evidence I'd just sworn didn't exist. "Thank you," she said. I didn't respond. Gratitude felt wrong for what I'd done. I hadn't saved them through courage or conviction. I'd simply chosen one kind of harm over another, and I wasn't certain I'd chosen correctly. I walked back to my truck alone, carrying my medical bag and a secret that would follow me until my death 16 years later. I filed the birth certificate the following week. Home birth. No attending medical staff beyond myself. Minor abnormalities noted. Oversized extremities. Hypertrichosis. Nothing that would trigger a closer look from the state. I signed my name at the bottom and sealed the record. Sarah named the child Thomas. I saw him twice more. The first time was 3 months later when I brought supplies to the cabin. Formula, though she said she was nursing. Antibiotics in case of infection. Basic infant care items. Thomas had grown at an accelerated rate. His eyes tracked me with unsettling awareness. His grip strength was extraordinary. He bent a metal spoon I offered him. The second visit, a year after the birth, I brought a stethoscope to check his heart. The cabin was empty. No note, no forwarding information. Just gone, deeper into the mountains or somewhere I couldn't follow. I never saw Sarah or Thomas again. I carried the secret for 16 years. It changed how I practiced medicine. Every time I signed a death certificate or filled out medical paperwork, I thought about that night. About the choice I'd made to hide the truth. In 1992, I began writing everything down. Not for publication. I had no intention of releasing it while I was alive. But the knowledge was eating at me. I needed to document it before it died with me. I died in 1994 from complications of heart disease. My daughter found the journals 2 years ago while settling my estate. Dr. Robert Marsh took his choice to the grave. The journals his daughter discovered contained detailed medical observations, sketches of Thomas's more unusual physiology, and coordinates to the cabin. Coordinates that led to an abandoned structure with no evidence of recent habitation. If his account is accurate, somewhere in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, a hybrid lineage may still exist, protected by a remoteness, hidden by a physician's oath to do no harm. What would you have done in his position? Reported the discovery and exposed the family to certain government intervention? Or falsified the records and buried evidence of the most significant biological finding of the century? The forests of the Cascade Mountains span millions of acres. Most of it has never been thoroughly explored. If Dr. Marsh's testimony is genuine, those trees still hold secrets that science refuses to acknowledge. Subscribe to Alien Files for more cases where impossible choices reveal uncomfortable truths about what might be hiding just beyond the reach of civilization.